The heavy titanium door slammed shut, sealing the head of the Chicago syndicate. Inside his own, climate-controlled vault, Silvio pounded his fists against the reinforced glass, screaming at the plump, terrified Maid he assumed had accidentally locked him in to save her own skin. But as the smoke from the breached penthouse doors began to clear, he stopped shouting. The heavy-set woman didn't cower in a corner. Instead, she calmly reached under her oversized grey uniform, drew a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP, and moved with the lethal, silent grace of an apex predator. The fat maid wasn't hiding. She was hunting. Gemma was invisible. It was a superpower she had cultivated meticulously over the past 3 years. At 250 pounds, standing 5'7", she was a large woman. She had wide hips, thick thighs, and a heavy bust, all of which she deliberately concealed beneath the shapeless drab grey cotton of her housekeeping uniform. In the gleaming, ruthless world of the Chicago underworld, a fat, quiet maid with a slight limp and a penchant for keeping her head down didn't register as a human being. To the men who commanded armies and moved millions, she was furniture. She was the help. She was nothing. And that was exactly how Gemma survived. The penthouse on Astor Street occupied the entire top floor of a high-rise in the Gold Coast neighborhood. It belonged to Silvio Marino. At 34, Silvio was the youngest head the Marino crime family had ever seen. He was a man who lived his life on a razor's edge, entirely dependent on his own sharp intellect and his ruthless enforcement of loyalty. Gemma ran the quiet, German-engineered Miele vacuum over the hand-woven Persian rug in Silvio's sprawling office. She moved methodically, her eyes taking in everything. She noted the empty bottle of Macallan 25 on the mahogany desk, calculating that Silvio had been up late, entertaining the Albanian delegates. She noticed the slight scuff marks on the hardwood floor near the balcony, indicating 2 men had stood there in a tense, pacing standoff. She memorized the layout of the loose papers, the position of the Beretta 92FS, carelessly left near the humidor, and the flashing green light of the encrypted router. To the untrained eye, Gemma was just a heavy woman struggling slightly to bend over and wipe the baseboards. In reality, her heart rate rested at a steady 60 beats per minute. Her muscles were loose and primed, and her mind was mapping the structural vulnerabilities of the room. The heavy mahogany doors to the office swung open. Silvio marched in, flanked by 2 of his top lieutenants, Matteo and Aldo. Silvio looked immaculate, as always wearing a charcoal grey Ermenegildo Zegna suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. A platinum Patek Philippe Nautilus gleamed on his left wrist as he aggressively loosened his silk tie. "The Albanians are pulling back on the port deal," Silvio snarled, walking right past Gemma without so much as a glance. He poured himself a measure of scotch. "They think we're weak because of the hit in Southside last week. We can lean on them, boss." Matteo offered a hulking brute of a man whose tailored jacket could barely contain his shoulders. "Send a message." "A message is loud," Silvio snapped, turning to face the window overlooking Lake Michigan. "Loud brings the feds. I want it handled quietly. Cut their supply lines. Starve them out." Gemma continued dusting the bookshelves. She bumped her hip intentionally against the heavy oak desk, letting out a soft, subservient apology in broken English. "Watch it," Aldo muttered with a sneer, looking at her with undisguised disgust. "Clumsy cow. Finish the floor and get out." Gemma bowed her head submissively. "Yes, sir." "Sorry, sir." She turned toward the door, her heavy footsteps thudding softly against the floorboards. She knew exactly what Aldo saw, a slow, soft target. Someone completely devoid of danger. That was when the explosion hit. It wasn't a random blast. It was a highly coordinated shaped charge detonation designed specifically to blow the reinforced steel pins out of the penthouse's private elevator doors. The sheer concussive force shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Glass rained down like diamond shrapnel. Silvio was thrown to the ground, the Scotch glass shattering in his hand. Matteo and Aldo immediately drew their weapons, shouting over the ringing in their ears. Through the smoke pouring into the foyer, laser sights cut through the haze. 3 men stepped out of the ruined elevator shaft. They were moving with tactical precision, dressed in all black, wearing specialized Arc'teryx assault gear, and wielding Daniel Defense Mk18 short-barreled rifles. They weren't street thugs. They were professional contractors. Matteo didn't even get a shot off. 2 suppressed bursts caught him in the chest and throat, dropping him instantly into a pool of his own blood. Aldo fired blindly into the smoke, screaming, but a sniper from a neighboring rooftop had an angle through the shattered windows. A single high-caliber round took Aldo in the side of the head, painting the imported wallpaper crimson. Silvio was entirely exposed. He scrambled backward, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his hands desperately searching for the Beretta he had left on the desk, but the explosion had knocked it away. He was a dead man. The lead contractor stepped into the office, his rifle raised, centering the red dot directly on Silvio's chest. Suddenly, a heavy force hit Silvio from the side. Gemma didn't hesitate. Dropping her feather duster, she closed the distance with terrifying, impossible speed for a woman of her size. She tackled Silvio by the waist, using her 250 pounds to drive him hard into the wall, entirely out of the line of fire. Bullets chewed through the mahogany desk, right where his torso had been, a fraction of a second prior. Before Silvio could even process the impact, Gemma grabbed him by his lapels. Her grip was like a steel vice. She hauled him off the floor and shoved him violently toward the back of the office, toward the disguised door of the reinforced titanium vault he used for sensitive storage. "Move!" she roared, her voice dropping the soft, submissive octave entirely. It was commanding, harsh, and heavily accented, with a crisp, brutal authority. She threw him inside the small 10-by-10 titanium-lined room. Silvio stumbled, falling to his knees. He turned back, expecting her to follow him in. Instead, Gemma stood in the doorway, her broad frame blocking his view of the ruined office. She looked back at him, her dark eyes entirely devoid of fear. "Lock it," she ordered. Before he could argue, she slammed the heavy vault door shut from the outside. The magnetic seals engaged with a heavy, final thud. Inside the vault, the silence was absolute. Silvio scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slammed his fists against the 4-inch thick bulletproof glass panel embedded in the center of the door. "Open the door! Open the damn door, you stupid woman!" He screamed, his voice muffled entirely by the acoustic dampening of the room. He was trapped. The vault was a dead zone. No cellular service, no landline, no way to call for his personal guard stationed in the lobby. He assumed the fat maid had locked him in to save herself, a terrified civilian, making a fatal mistake in the heat of a crisis. She was going to be slaughtered, and then the hit squad would simply bring in thermal lances to cut through the door. It was only a matter of time. Silvio pressed his face against the cool glass, his breath fogging the pain. Through the small rectangular window, he had a limited view of the office and the hallway leading to the foyer. He watched as the smoke began to clear. The 3 contractors fanned out. They were communicating via headsets, their movements sharp and synchronized. They stepped over Aldo's lifeless body, sweeping the corners of the room. Where was the maid? Silvio squinted. He couldn't see her. She must have hidden under a desk, cowering and weeping. One of the contractors, a tall man with a scar running down his jaw, moved toward the shattered windows to check the balcony. The second man stayed near the door to provide cover. The third, the team leader, approached the vault door. The leader checked the digital keypad on the titanium door and cursed. He tapped his headset. "Target is secured inside the secondary vault. Bring up the torches. We have maybe 10 minutes before local law enforcement responds to the blast." Silvio felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He stepped back from the glass, looking around the small room for a weapon. Nothing but stacks of cash, encrypted ledgers, and a few gold bars. He was utterly defenseless. Outside, the contractor near the hallway turned his head. A soft scraping sound had echoed from the adjoining corridor. The man raised his MK-18, slicing the pie as he moved into the hallway. Silvio watched through the glass, his breath catching. The contractor turned the corner. From the ceiling, dropping like a silent, heavy stone, Gemma descended. She had wedged herself between the narrow walls of the corridor near the ceiling, an impossible feat of upper body strength given her weight. She dropped directly onto the man's shoulders. The physics were devastating. 250 pounds of dense mass, combined with the momentum of gravity, snapped the contractor's neck the instant she landed on him. The man crumpled to the floor without a single sound, his spine completely severed. Silvio's jaw dropped. He stepped closer to the glass, wiping the fog away with a trembling hand. Gemma didn't roll away. She stayed low to the ground. In one fluid motion, she unclipped the heavy, customized combat knife from the dead man's chest rig, discarding it in favor of reaching beneath her own oversized grey dress. She pulled out a jet-black, suppressed Heckler & Koch USP. It wasn't a standard gangbanger weapon. It was an operator's pistol. She didn't look like a clumsy, overweight maid anymore. Her posture had completely shifted. She maintained a tight center-axis relock stance, keeping the weapon close to her chest to maintain control in close quarters. Her wide hips and heavy base, which made her look sluggish when she was sweeping floors, now provided an incredibly stable low center of gravity. The second contractor, the one on the balcony, noticed the absence of his partner's footsteps. He turned his boots, crunching on the broken glass. "Bravo 2 report," he muttered, stepping back into the office. Gemma emerged from the hallway. She didn't sprint. She glided, stepping precisely where the floorboards wouldn't creak. The contractor swung his rifle toward her. He saw a fat woman in a maid's uniform, and for a fatal fraction of a second, his brain failed to process her as a lethal threat. He hesitated. It was all Gemma needed. She fired twice. Pfft. Pfft. The suppressed rounds were whisper quiet. The first bullet took the man in the sternum, cracking his ceramic strike plate. The second found the unprotected gap right under his chin, traveling up into his brain stem. He dropped like a marionette with its strings cut. Silvio pressed his hands against the glass, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. The woman who had spent the last 8 months apologizing for bumping into his furniture, the woman who sweated profusely while carrying his laundry, was currently dismantling an elite kill squad with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a veteran assassin. The team leader, standing only 10 feet from the vault door, heard the heavy thud of the second body hitting the floor. He spun around, raising his rifle. Gemma was already moving. She knew she was out in the open now, and the team leader had his sights on her. He pulled the trigger, firing a burst of 5.56 rounds. Gemma used her momentum. She threw her heavy frame into a brutal rolling dive behind the massive oak desk. Wood splintered and shattered as the bullets tore through the furniture, but she had successfully broken the line of sight. The leader advanced slowly, his weapon trained on the desk. "Come out, bitch. I'll make it quick," he barked, pulling a flashbang grenade from his vest. Silvio watched, completely powerless. He wanted to shout to warn her, but the glass was too thick. The leader pulled the pin on the flashbang and tossed it behind the desk. In a fraction of a second, Gemma kicked the heavy Persian rug up with her thick leg, catching the rolling grenade in the heavy fabric. She threw her entire body weight onto the far edge of the rug, suffocating the concussive blast and blinding flash beneath the thick layers of wool. A muffled crump shook the floor, but the blinding light was contained. The team leader hesitated, confused by the lack of a blinding flash. That hesitation cost him his life. Gemma lunged from the opposite side of the desk. She didn't bother raising her pistol. Instead, she charged him. The man tried to track her with his rifle, but she was too close. She slammed her shoulder directly into his chest. Mass is momentum. Weight is leverage. 250 pounds colliding at a dead sprint knocked the breath from the highly trained killer, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the plaster wall. Before he could recover, Gemma pinned his rifle against the wall with her left arm. With her right hand, she drew a Microtech Halo Viper out the front blade from her apron pocket. The steel snapped out with a vicious clack. She drove it upward, sliding it effortlessly between the plates of his body armor and straight into his heart. She twisted the blade once, pulled it out, and let the man slide down the wall, leaving a thick smear of blood against the expensive floral wallpaper. Gemma stood up slowly. She wiped the blood from her cheek with the back of her sleeve. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving slightly, and then she turned her gaze toward the vault. Through the bulletproof glass, her dark eyes met Silvio's. There was no warmth in them, no subservience, only the cold, calculating stare of a predator assessing its territory. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Silvio stood perfectly still behind the glass, the reality of his situation violently shifting. He wasn't the apex predator in the room anymore. He was the prey, and he had just been placed in a cage by something far more dangerous. Gemma holstered her pistol beneath her dress. She didn't immediately come to let him out. Instead, she began a systematic sweep of the bodies. She moved with ruthless efficiency. She checked the pulse of the team leader, patted down his tactical vest, and pulled out a heavy encrypted satellite phone. She checked his wrists, peeling back the sleeve of his black combat shirt. Silvio saw her pause. She leaned in closer, inspecting a small faded tattoo on the dead man's inner forearm. A dark expression crossed her face. It was a look of recognition, followed swiftly by cold fury. She stood up, grabbed the leader's spare magazines, and shoved them into the deep pockets of her apron. Then she walked to the desk, picked up the Beretta 92FS that Silvio had lost in the blast, checked the chamber, and tucked it into her waistband. Only then did she approach the vault door. She punched a 6-digit code into the digital keypad. Silvio's breath caught. She knows the code. He changed the access combination weekly. Only he and his late underboss, Matteo, knew the sequence. The heavy magnetic locks clanked loudly. The titanium door swung open on its massive hinges, letting the smell of cordite copper blood and pulverized drywall into the sterile air of the vault. Gemma stood in the doorway, blocking his exit. "We have 3 minutes," she said. Her voice was completely different now. Gone was the high-pitched, apologetic squeak of the terrified Maid. Her tone was low, steady, and gravelly. "The police will secure the perimeter in 5. But whoever sent these men will have a secondary containment team downstairs. We need to move." Silvio didn't step forward. He stared at her, his mind racing. "Who the hell are you?" Gemma looked at him, her expression flat. "I'm the woman who vacuums your floors, Mr. Marino, and right now, I'm the only reason your brains aren't decorating your Picasso in the hallway. Put your shoes on." "You killed 3 Tier 1 operators in under 60 seconds. Silvio said, his voice dangerously low. He was trying to assert dominance, trying to reclaim the power dynamic. He stepped closer to her, puffing out his chest. "You knew my vault code. You're a plant. Who do you work for? The Falcone family? The feds?" Gemma didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She just looked at him, entirely unimpressed. She stepped into his personal space. Her sheer physical presence was intimidating, her broad shoulders squaring off against his. "If I worked for the Falcones, I would have let them shoot you," she said coldly. "If I worked for the feds, you'd be in handcuffs. I don't work for anyone. I am hiding. And your little Mafia turf war just blew my cover." Silvio frowned, calculating. "Hiding from who?" Gemma glanced back at the body of the team leader. "From the men who trained him. The tattoo on his arm. It's a mark from a black site private military firm operating out of Eastern Europe. They don't do Mafia hits. They do high-value asset retrieval." She turned back to Silvio, her eyes narrowing. "Which means they didn't come here for you, Silvio. They used the explosive breach as cover." She pointed a thick finger at his chest. "They came here for me. You were just collateral damage." Silvio's mind reeled. The head of the Chicago syndicate, a man who commanded fear and respect across the city, was entirely irrelevant to the bloodbath in his own penthouse. It was an insulting, staggering realization. They breached the elevator. Gemma continued moving past him into the vault to grab a heavy duffel bag of emergency cash he kept on the bottom shelf. She slung it over her shoulder effortlessly. "That means the stairwells are likely compromised with tripwires or a holding team. The lobby is a kill zone." "There's a service elevator," Silvio said, his survival instincts finally overriding his bruised ego. "It runs down to the laundry sub-basement. No cameras. We use it for discreet product transport." "Good. Lead the way." Gemma gestured toward the door with her pistol. "Wait." Silvio stopped looking at her. "You're taking me with you. You know the building. I know how to kill the men trying to stop us." Gemma replied, her face a mask of brutal pragmatism. "Symbiosis, Mr. Marino. Now walk, or I'll shoot you in the knee and leave you for the secondary team." Silvio looked into her eyes. He had negotiated with cartels, threatened politicians, and stared down serial killers. But looking at the fat maid in the blood-spattered grey uniform, he felt a genuine freezing chill run down his spine. She wasn't bluffing. He nodded slowly. "The service corridor is through the kitchen." "Stay low," Gemma ordered. "If shooting starts, get behind me. I have the mass to absorb the recoil and hold the line. You don't." Silvio swallowed hard, his expensive Zegna suit ruined with plaster dust and Matteo's blood. He stepped out of the vault, stepping carefully over the bodies of his fallen men. As they moved toward the kitchen, Silvio couldn't help but watch her. She moved with a heavy, terrifying grace. The very weight that made her invisible to the world was her armor and her weapon. He realized with a sickening knot in his stomach that he had invited an apex predator into his home, handed her the keys to his kingdom, and treated her like dirt. And now his life belonged entirely to her. They reached the stainless steel double doors of the industrial kitchen. Gemma paused, pressing her ear against the cool metal. She held up a thick hand, signaling him to stop. From the other side of the door, the distinct metallic clack of a rifle bolt sliding forward echoed through the quiet room. Gemma looked back at Silvio, a grim, bloodthirsty smile spreading across her face. "Round 2, she whispered. The heavy stainless steel door of the industrial kitchen swung inward with a muted squeak. The man stepping through the threshold wore the same Arc'teryx tactical gear as the dead squad in the penthouse, his night vision goggles pushed up on his helmet eyes, scanning the gleaming prep tables. He was sweeping the room, his suppressed rifle leading the way. Gemma didn't give him a chance to acquire a target. She was crouched behind a massive Vulcan commercial gas range, her heavy frame perfectly concealed by the thick steel of the oven doors. As the contractor stepped past a rack of hanging copper pots, Gemma drove her heel into the ground and surged upward. She grabbed the handle of a cast-iron skillet resting on the stovetop. It weighed a solid 12 pounds. With a brutal, sweeping arc, she slammed the heavy iron directly into the side of the contractor's Kevlar helmet. The sickening crack of the impact echoed over the hum of the commercial refrigerators. The helmet protected his skull from splitting, but the sheer blunt force trauma snapped his head sideways, instantly scrambling his equilibrium. He staggered, his rifle dipping toward the tiled floor. Gemma didn't stop. She dropped the skillet, grabbed his combat vest with her left hand, and violently yanked him forward off balance. As he stumbled into her space, she brought her right knee up in a devastating strike, burying it deep into his unarmored solar plexus. The breath exploded from his lungs in a wet gasp. She finished the sequence by driving the butt of her Heckler & Koch USP into his temple. The man collapsed like a sack of wet cement. "Move," Gemma hissed, not even waiting to see the body hit the floor. Silvio, completely stripped of his usual arrogant composure, scrambled behind her. His expensive Ermenegildo Zegna suit was stained with soot and blood. He watched in a state of suspended shock as his housekeeper expertly stripped the unconscious man of his spare magazines, slotting them into the oversized pockets of her grey uniform dress. "Through the pantry," Gemma ordered, pointing with the barrel of her pistol. "The service elevator is at the back." They navigated the narrow aisles of dry goods and imported olive oils. Silvio's heart hammered against his ribs. The power dynamic had shifted so violently, he felt seasick. He was the head of the Merino Syndicate, a man who commanded hundreds of loyal soldiers, yet right now he was utterly useless. He was a liability. The fat, limping woman he had verbally abused for 8 months was the only thing standing between him and a zipped body bag. They reached the heavy reinforced doors of the freight elevator. Gemma punched the call button. The gears groaned, and the doors rattled open to reveal a scarred, metal-paneled interior that smelled of bleach and old linen. "Get in the corner. Keep your head down," Gemma instructed, dragging the heavy metal gate shut. She slammed her palm against the button for the sub-basement. The elevator jerked and began its slow, grinding descent. The sheer, terrifying silence of the shaft enveloped them. Silvio slid down the metal wall, his knees pulling up to his chest. He looked up at Gemma. She was checking the chamber of the dead contractor's rifle, her face a mask of stone-cold concentration. She looked completely at home, holding a weapon of war. "You're not a maid," Silvio breathed, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question, but a desperate need to vocalize the impossible reality. Gemma clicked the safety on and let the rifle hang on its tactical sling across her broad chest. "Astute observation, Mr. Marino." "Who are you running from?" Silvio demanded, a spark of his old authority flickering back to life. "You bring a hit squad into my home, kill my men, and drag me into this. I demand to know what kind of war I'm in." Gemma looked down at him, her dark eyes entirely devoid of sympathy. "You don't make demands anymore, Silvio. You survive. That's your only job right now." She leaned back against the opposite wall, the elevator shuddering slightly as it passed the 30th floor. "The men upstairs belong to the Vales Group. They are a private military contractor operating out of the Balkans. They specialize in extractions, black site interrogations, and erasing people who become inconvenient to very powerful governments." Silvio swallowed hard. The Vales Group. Even in the underworld, they were a ghost story. Rumors of a rogue PMC that operated with zero oversight and absolute ruthlessness. "And you worked for them." "I was their lead extraction specialist," Gemma said, her voice dropping a register sounding like grinding granite. "I was the one they sent to pull high-value targets out of heavily fortified locations. 6 years ago, they ordered me to extract a whistleblower in Prague. But the target wasn't a spy. It was a 14-year-old girl who had seen something she shouldn't have." Gemma's jaw tightened. "I don't do kids. I killed my commanding officer, took the girl to a safe house, and vanished." They've been hunting me ever since." Silvio stared at her heavy frame, the wide hips and thick waist. And the disguise. A grim, humorless smile touched Gemma's lips. "Physical camouflage. I spent 2 years intentionally putting on 80 pounds. I altered my gait to fake a bad knee. I adopted an accent and took menial jobs. People see a fat, slow immigrant woman sweeping floors and their brain automatically categorizes her as harmless. Invisible. You did it yourself. You looked right past me every single day." Silvio felt a flush of genuine shame, a rare emotion for the mob boss. She was right. He had never once looked her in the eye. Suddenly the elevator halted with a violent screeching jolt. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. A second later, the emergency red backup lights hummed to life, bathing the scarred metal car in a bloody glow. "They cut the winch power," Gemma said, her voice entirely calm. "They know we're in the shaft." Silvio cursed loudly, scrambling to his feet. "We're trapped in a metal box." "No," Gemma said, stepping onto a heavy milk crate left in the corner of the elevator. She reached up to the ceiling panel. "We're in a choke point, and I don't die in boxes." She pressed her thick, powerful hands against the emergency escape hatch in the ceiling. With a sharp grunt, she shoved the rusted metal plate upward, flipping it out of the way. Cool, drafty air from the elevator shaft rushed in. "Up," she ordered, looking down at Silvio. Now. The elevator shaft was a cavern of grease-coated cables and echoing darkness. Gemma hauled herself through the ceiling hatch with terrifying ease, her upper body strength entirely unhindered by her heavy frame. She reached down her thick forearm, rippling with muscle, and grabbed Silvio by the collar of his ruined suit jacket. With one brutal heave, she pulled the 180-pound Mafia boss through the hatch as if he were a rag doll. "Don't look down," Gemma whispered, handing him the Beretta 92 FS she had taken from the office. "We are 4 floors above the sub-basement. We climb down the maintenance ladder on the wall. If you slip, I won't catch you." Silvio gripped the cold, greasy rungs of the ladder, his imported Baluti leather shoes slipping dangerously with every step. Above them, he could hear the distant, echoing shouts of men breaching the elevator doors on the upper floors. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness far above like searching laser beams. They moved quickly, the scrape of their shoes masked by the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system. Gemma moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace, her boots finding every rung perfectly. They reached the sub-basement level. Gemma bypassed the main doors, pulling a heavy crowbar from a maintenance box on the wall. She wedged it into the gap of a secondary ventilation grate and popped it open. "Crawl," she instructed. Silvio scrambled through the dusty duct, dropping out the other side, into the stifling heat of the building's industrial laundry room. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of bleach. Massive Speed Queen washing machines hummed along the walls, blowing thick clouds of steam from their exhaust pipes. The room was a labyrinth of hanging linen racks, rolling carts, and heavy machinery. It was dark, hot, and visually chaotic. It was a hunter's paradise. "Stay behind the commercial dryer," Gemma whispered, pushing Silvio into a shadowed alcove. "Do not shoot unless a target is looking directly at you. Muzzle flashes in this steam will give away your position." Before Silvio could nod, she vanished into the fog. She didn't walk. She stalked, blending perfectly into the heavy shadows and rolling clouds of white vapor. Silvio gripped the Beretta, his hands shaking. He strained his ears. Over the rhythmic sloshing of the washing machines, he heard the heavy thud of tactical boots. 3 Vales Group contractors fanned out into the laundry room. Their laser sights sliced through the steam in bright emerald green beams. They were communicating via hand signals, moving with the cold precision of men who killed for a paycheck. The lead contractor moved past a rolling cart, overflowing with bloody hotel towels. From beneath the towels, a hand shot out. Gemma had buried herself inside the cart. She grabbed the man by the front of his tactical vest and pulled him violently forward, directly into the heavy steel frame of the cart. As his face smashed into the metal, she looped a length of braided steel wire, pulled from the elevator shaft around his throat. She stood up behind him, her heavy weight anchoring the wire. She crossed her wrists and pulled backward, driving her knee into his spine. The contractor thrashed wildly, his boots kicking against the wet floor, his hands desperately clawing at his throat. But Gemma was an immovable object. Within seconds the thrashing stopped. She lowered the dead man quietly to the floor, reburying him under the towels. The second contractor, 20 yards away, noticed the sudden absence of his teammate's laser sight in the fog. He raised his fist, signaling a halt, and spoke softly into his headset. Gemma used the noise of a venting steam pipe to mask her approach. She flanked him, moving behind a row of industrial presses. As the man turned the corner to investigate the cart, Gemma lunged from the shadows. She didn't use a weapon. She used the environment. She slammed both hands into the man's chest, shoving him backward with the force of a battering ram. He stumbled back, his spine colliding violently with the exposed, scalding hot pipes of the primary boiler. The man screamed a high, piercing sound of absolute agony as the superheated metal seared through his combat shirt and burned his flesh. As his mouth opened in a scream, Gemma stepped forward, clamped her thick, calloused hand over his mouth to muffle the sound, and drove her microtech blade upward into the soft spot beneath his jaw. She held him pinned against the pipe until his eyes rolled back, then let him slide into a heap. Silvio watched from the shadows, mesmerized. He had known violent men his entire life. He employed sociopaths and killers, but he had never seen anything like this. Gemma didn't just kill, she orchestrated death. She was a master of leveraging physics, environment, and psychology against her enemies. Looking at her broad shoulders and fierce, blood-streaked face, Silvio felt a strange, terrifying thrill entirely unrelated to fear. She was magnificent. Only one contractor remained. Point man. He had heard the muffled scream. He knew his team was gone. Panic overrode his training. He began firing blindly into the steam, sweeping his rifle in wide, desperate arcs. Gemma didn't hide. She stepped out from behind a row of washing machines 15 feet away. The man spun toward her, raising his rifle. Gemma fired her USP once. The bullet shattered the man's kneecap. He shrieked, collapsing onto the wet floor, his rifle clattering away. Gemma walked toward him slowly, her heavy boots splashing in the puddles of condensation. She kicked his rifle under a machine and crouched beside him, pressing the hot suppressor of her pistol against his uninjured knee. "You didn't breach this building on your own," Gemma growled, her voice a low, terrifying rumble. "This penthouse has biometric lockouts on the main grid. Who gave you the override codes?" The mercenary gritted his teeth, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the tiles. "Go to hell, pig." Gemma didn't blink. She pressed the trigger slightly. "I'm already there, and I'm the one running the boiler. Tell me who gave you the codes, or I'll shoot your other knee, pack the wounds with bleach powder from that barrel, and leave you here to rot." The man looked into her eyes and saw nothing but an abyss. The bravado drained out of him instantly. Marino. It was a Marino. The cousin. In the shadows, Silvio felt the world drop out from beneath him. "Enzo," Silvio whispered, stepping out of the steam. His voice was cracked, hollow. Enzo was his right hand. His blood. "Enzo gave you the codes." The mercenary nodded weakly, clutching his shattered leg. He wanted you dead. The Valles group wanted the woman. We struck a deal. He disabled the grid, we provided the firepower. He takes over the family tomorrow morning. Silvio staggered backward, his hands running through his ruined hair. Betrayal from within. It was the oldest, deadliest sin in his world, and he had been blind to it. Gemma stood up. She looked at the mercenary, then down at Silvio. She didn't ask for permission. She simply raised her pistol and fired a single round into the contractor's head, silencing him forever. "The garage is down the hall," Gemma said, ejecting the spent magazine and slamming a fresh one home. "Your car is parked in the VIP bay. We leave now." Silvio looked at her. He had lost his men, his penthouse, and his empire. His own cousin had signed his death warrant. It had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the terrifying, beautiful weapon of a woman standing in front of him. "My armored Maybach is in Bay 4. Silvio said, his voice hardening, the shock slowly morphing into a cold, diamond-hard rage. He walked past the bodies, his posture straightening. He was a Merino. He didn't break. They pushed through the heavy fire doors into the concrete expanse of the underground parking garage. The sleek, black Mercedes Maybach S680 Guard sat in the corner, a fortress on wheels. Silvio tossed her the heavy key fob. "You drive." Gemma caught the keys effortlessly. She slid into the driver's seat, the heavy leather groaning under her weight. She hit the ignition, and the massive V12 engine roared to life with a deep, guttural growl that echoed through the concrete bunker. Silvio climbed into the passenger seat. He looked over at the woman in the blood-stained maid's uniform. "Where to Mr. Marino?" Gemma asked, slamming the armored car into drive. Silvio stared straight ahead, his eyes burning with a lethal promise. "To war, Gemma. We are going to war." The Mercedes Maybach S680 Guard tore through the reinforced steel barrier of the parking garage like a 6-ton battering ram. The heavy roll-up doors crumpled and sparked, raining shredded aluminum onto the wet pavement of Lower Wacker Drive. Gemma didn't even tap the brakes. She gripped the leather steering wheel with thick, calloused hands, her eyes locked on the subterranean labyrinth of concrete pillars and flickering sodium lights. "They'll have a perimeter street team," Gemma said, her voice cutting through the roar of the V12 engine. "A hit of this magnitude requires a containment ring." Silvio gripped the grab handle, his knuckles white. The shock of his cousin's betrayal had crystallized into a cold, absolute clarity. Enzo had sold him to the Valles group. Enzo had ordered his execution. In the Mafia, blood was everything, but spilled blood demanded a reckoning. "Lower Wacker is a gridlock at this hour," Silvio said, his tactical mind finally catching up to the adrenaline. "Take the maintenance access ramp toward the Stevenson Expressway. If we hit the highway, the armor on this car will buy us enough time to lose them." "No highways," Gemma countered, throwing the massive armored sedan into a drifting four-wheel slide around a tight corner. The tires screamed in protest. "On an open road, they'll call in a drone strike or ram us with a heavy transport. We stay in the concrete. We stay in the shadows." In the rearview mirror, a pair of blacked-out Chevrolet Suburbans swerved out from a side tunnel, their high beams cutting through the gloom. They were moving incredibly fast, accelerating with the unnatural whine of modified engines. "Hold on!" Gemma growled. Instead of outrunning them, she slammed her foot down on the brake pedal. The Maybach, weighing over 10,000 pounds, with its VR9-rated ballistic steel plating and bulletproof glass, decelerated violently. The lead Suburban, anticipating a high-speed chase, couldn't react in time. It slammed squarely into the reinforced rear bumper of the Maybach. The impact was deafening, but the German engineering held. The Suburban's front end crumpled like a discarded soda can, the radiator instantly exploding in a geyser of hissing steam. The SUV spun out of control, slamming into a concrete support pillar and flipping onto its side. The second Suburban swerved to avoid the wreckage, pulling up parallel to the Maybach. The tinted windows rolled down, revealing 3 mercenaries armed with heavy assault rifles. Muzzle flashes erupted in the darkness, a torrential downpour of armor-piercing rounds hammering against the Maybach's passenger side windows. Silvio flinched, but the 3-inch thick polycarbonate glass merely spiderwebbed the cabin, remaining entirely unbreached. Gemma didn't panic. She didn't return fire. She simply turned the steering wheel sharply to the right, using the sheer unstoppable mass of the Maybach to pin the Suburban against the concrete wall of the tunnel. Metal shrieked against metal in a shower of brilliant orange sparks. She kept the accelerator pinned, grinding the enemy vehicle against the barrier until its axles snapped and it ground to a catastrophic halt. Gemma straightened the wheel and accelerated away from the wreckage, leaving the Valey's group containment team burning in the subterranean dark. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the cabin was the low hum of the engine and the heavy breathing of the 2 survivors. Gemma navigated a series of back alleys in the industrial sector of Pilsen, finally pulling the battered but functional Maybach into an abandoned, graffiti-covered warehouse. She killed the engine. The silence was heavy, thick with the smell of scorched rubber and adrenaline. Silvio turned his head, looking at the woman in the driver's seat. The grey maid's uniform was torn and stained with blood, plaster, and grease. Her hair, usually kept in a tight, submissive bun, had come loose, hanging in dark, damp strands around her broad face. She was massive, intimidating, and undeniably lethal. You spent 2 years pretending to be a slow, overweight housekeeper. Silvio said, the awe in his voice impossible to hide. You cleaned my floors. You let my men disrespect you. You let me disrespect you. Gemma wiped a smear of blood from her cheek with the back of her hand. Ego gets you killed in my line of work, Silvio. I needed to disappear. The best way to vanish in America is to become someone the wealthy refuse to look at. A fat, limping woman with a mop. I ate a massive caloric surplus, lifted heavy weights in a basement, and built a body that looked soft, but acted as a biomechanical anchor for close-quarters combat. She looked at him, her dark eyes piercing right through his ruined, expensive exterior. I didn't care about your disrespect. I cared about the paycheck and the roof over my head. But Enzo's little coup destroyed my cover. Enzo. Silvio spat the name like a curse. His jaw tightened, the mob boss re-emerging from the ashes of the ambush. He'll be at the Onyx Club. It's a private cigar lounge in the Loop. He booked it exclusively tonight. I thought he was entertaining a city alderman. He was actually setting up his own coronation. He's waiting for the call to confirm I'm dead. Gemma unbuckled her seatbelt and reached under the dashboard, popping the trunk. Then we make sure he gets the message in person. Come on. I have a cache hidden here. Silvio followed her to the back of the car. Gemma pushed aside a stack of wooden pallets, revealing a heavy steel footlocker bolted to the warehouse floor. She entered a combination, and the lid popped open. Inside was an arsenal that would make a cartel blush. Suppressed submachine guns, tactical vests, flashbangs, and rows of high-caliber ammunition. Gemma began stripping off the ruined grey maid's dress. Silvio respectfully averted his eyes, but he couldn't help but notice the sheer power of her physique. There was no soft, vulnerable flesh. She was built like a powerlifter, a dense, terrifying wall of muscle layered beneath a thick barrier of insulation. She pulled on a pair of black tactical pants that accommodated her wide hips and a reinforced dark grey combat sweater. She strapped a heavy drop-leg holster to her thick thigh and loaded her Heckler & Koch USP. She tossed a sleek black Sig Sauer P226 and 2 spare magazines to Silvio. He caught them smoothly, checking the slide and the chamber with practiced ease. I'm not a soldier, Gemma. Silvio said, holstering the weapon at his waist. "But I know how to kill the men who betray me." Gemma racked the bolt of a B&T AP-C9 submachine gun, the metallic clack echoing in the empty warehouse. She looked at Silvio, a grim, dangerous smile spreading across her lips. "Good," she said, "because tonight we're going to burn his kingdom to the ground." The Onyx Club occupied the top 2 floors of a historic brick building overlooking the Chicago River. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of imported Cuban cigars, rare mahogany, and arrogance. Enzo Marino stood at the head of a long, polished oak table, a crystal glass of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon in his hand. He was a sharp-featured man with slicked-back hair, wearing a navy blue suit. Seated around the table were the 4 remaining captains of the Marino family men who had sworn loyalty to Silvio, but were practical enough to bow to the man holding the gun. "To Silvio," Enzo said, raising his glass, a mock expression of sorrow on his face. A tragic victim of the Albanian feud. He was a visionary, but he was too soft for the wars to come. Tonight we honor him. Tomorrow we secure the ports. The captains raised their glasses, murmuring their hesitant agreements. The heavy oak doors of the lounge didn't burst open. They swung inward, quietly. The lights in the club suddenly flickered, and a sharp, high-pitched electronic squeal emanated from the security cameras mounted in the corners of the room. Gemma had found the building's localized server room and introduced a localized electromagnetic pulse charge, blinding Enzo's security detail downstairs. Enzo frowned, lowering his glass. "Franco, go check the breaker." Franco, a massive enforcer with a broken nose, stood up and walked toward the entrance. He stepped into the dimly lit hallway. A heavy gloved hand shot out from the shadows, clamping securely over Franco's mouth. Before the enforcer could struggle, a thick, powerful arm wrapped around his throat in a blood choke. Gemma, utilizing her incredible upper body strength and weight advantage, lifted Franco slightly off his feet, severing the blood flow to his brain in seconds. He went limp, and she lowered his 260-pound frame silently to the carpeted floor. Inside the lounge, Enzo grew impatient. "Franco, what the hell is taking so long?" "Franco is indisposed." "Enzo," a voice echoed from the doorway. The room froze. Silvio stepped into the light of the crystal chandelier. His charcoal suit was torn, ruined, and stained with Matteo's blood, but his posture was that of an undisputed king. The Sig Sauer P226 in his right hand was steady, pointed directly at Enzo's chest. Behind Silvio, Gemma stepped into the frame of the double doors. She didn't look like a maid. Dressed in dark, tactical gear, holding the suppressed submachine gun at the low ready, she looked like an executioner. The remaining captains, hard men who had spent their lives in the criminal underworld, felt a visceral, primal wave of terror wash over them, just looking at her broad, unyielding silhouette. "Silvio." Enzo whispered, the color draining from his face entirely. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor, the expensive bourbon pooling around his Italian loafers. "You." "The Albanians." "The Albanians had nothing to do with it, you cowardly piece of filth," Silvio said, his voice deadly calm. He advanced slowly into the room. "You bought a mercenary death squad to do your heavy lifting. You sold my life for a chair at the head of a table." One of the captains, a nervous man named Dante, reached inside his jacket for his weapon. Gemma didn't shout a warning. She simply raised the B&T APC-9 and fired a single suppressed round. The bullet shattered Dante's wrist. He screamed, dropping his gun and collapsing back into his chair. "Hands on the table," Gemma commanded, her voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "All of you. Now." The remaining captains slammed their hands onto the oak wood, terrified of the giant silent killer guarding their boss. Enzo backed away, hitting the edge of the mahogany bar. He raised his hands defensively. "Silvio, wait. We can talk about this. It was business, just business. The Veles group approached me. They wanted the woman. She brought the war to us." Silvio didn't blink. He closed the distance, standing inches from his traitorous cousin. "She brought me survival, Enzo," Silvio said softly. "You brought me a knife in the back. In this family, the penalty for treason is absolute." "Silvio, please." Silvio raised the Sig Sauer and pulled the trigger. The unsuppressed gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space of the cigar lounge. Enzo's head snapped back a mist of crimson, painting the expensive liquor bottles behind the bar. He crumpled to the floor, dead before his knees hit the hardwood. The ringing in the room slowly faded, replaced by the terrified, ragged breathing of the surviving captains. Silvio didn't look at the body. He slowly turned to face the men seated at the table. He tucked the hot pistol into his waistband and adjusted the lapels of his ruined, blood-stained jacket. "My cousin was the victim of an unfortunate fatal robbery," Silvio announced to the room, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "I am still the head of this family. The ports remain ours. The Albanians will be dealt with. Do any of you have a dissenting opinion?" The captains shook their heads frantically, their eyes darting between Silvio and the hulking, lethal woman standing guard at the door. Silvio walked over to Gemma. The adrenaline of the night was beginning to fade, leaving behind a profound sense of clarity. He looked up at her. She was a foot shorter than his own enforcers, but she cast a shadow larger than any man he had ever known. She had saved his life, orchestrated his revenge, and restored his empire. "The Veles group knows you're alive," Silvio said softly, ensuring the captains couldn't hear. "They know you're in Chicago. Running again will only delay the inevitable." Gemma lowered her weapon, meeting his gaze. "I've been running for 6 years, Silvio. I'm tired of hiding in plain sight." "Then don't," Silvio said, holding out his hand, not as a boss giving an order to a maid, but as a king offering an alliance to an equal. "Stay. The Marino family has the money, the infrastructure, and the soldiers to build a fortress they can never breach. You protected my empire tonight, Gemma. Let me protect you." Gemma looked at his outstretched hand. She thought of the cold, lonely years, the constant paranoia, the degrading disguises. She looked at the man who had just reclaimed his throne through sheer willpower and her tactical brilliance. They were two predators in a world of prey, and together they were untouchable. A slow, genuine smile finally touched Gemma's lips. She reached out with her heavy, calloused hand and gripped his firmly. "I don't clean floors anymore, Silvio," she said. Silvio smiled back, the blood and soot on his face failing to hide his admiration. "No," Silvio agreed. "You don't, and that is how the fat Maid traded her feather duster for a submachine gun and became the undisputed queen of the Chicago underworld." The dynamic between Gemma and Silvio completely shifted from invisible servant to a lethal power couple, proving that you should never underestimate someone just because they don't look like a typical action hero. If you loved the intense tactical action, the brutal twists, and seeing Enzo get exactly what he deserved, smash that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our thrilling storytime drops. What was your favorite moment of Gemma taking out the hit squad? Let me know down in the comments section below, and share this video with anyone who loves a high-stakes mafia drama. See you in the next story.